Sweet. Okay, let's get going here. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining this evening. My name is Sammy Godlove. I'm the Central Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. And tonight's webcast, if you haven't already guessed, is all about the Roadless Rule and the places it protects, and then what's at stake if it is repealed, because this is a rule that's very much at risk right now. So throughout April, Oregon Wild and several of our partner organizations, we held public town halls in support of the Roadless Rule in Portland, Eugene, and Bend. And hundreds of people showed up to those, voiced their support for the Roadless Rule. We got pretty overwhelming feedback on those to the point where we decided to host a virtual version of those in-person events. So that's what we're doing tonight. That's why we're here. And tonight I'm joined by my colleague at Oregon Wild, Chandra Legui, Carson States, a wildland firefighter based in Oregon, Michelle Emmons from Willamette Riverkeeper, and Carl Feindling from Friends of Heart Mountain and the Oregon chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Before we jump into it, I just have a few housekeeping items to quickly go over. First, thank you to all who purchased a raffle ticket this evening. We'll be raffling off a copy of our Oregon Ancient Forest Hiking Guide, which was written by Chandra. Also includes many Oregon roadless areas. And then also raffling off an Oregon Wild t-shirt. These raffle tickets, the purchases, not only help us continue these Wild Wednesday presentations, but also make our work at Oregon Wild possible. So thank you for that. The winners will be notified via email within the next day or two, so keep an eye out for that. Next, a recording of this webcast will be sent out to everyone who registered and will also be posted on our website, oregonwild.org. And then lastly, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to submit your questions at any point throughout the presentation. You can submit questions by using that icon that says Q&A on the menu on the screen, either at the bottom or top of your screen. And then, yeah, just feel free to submit those questions at any time. We'll have a few minutes at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start us off tonight by just giving some background on the Roadless Rule, what it is, what's going on with the proposed rescission of this rule. And then I will invite our guest speakers to discuss how repealing the Roadless Rule would impact very important things like fire, like clean water, fish and wildlife habitat, outdoor recreation, many other important things that roadless areas provide for us. And then we'll let you know how you can get involved, how you can take action to help defend these places. Okay, so the Roadless Area Conservation Rule, this was established back in 2001 to protect 58.5 million acres of our wildest, most intact forests on our national forest system. All of the dark shading on this map is places protected by the Roadless Rule back in 2001. These places are called inventoried roadless areas, or IRAs. And if you remember from the quiz, the Roadless Rule also prohibits road construction, development, commercial logging, mining, oil and gas leases in these protected areas. So in Oregon, it's about 2 million acres that's protected by the rule. So 2 million acres of roadless areas here, that's all shaded in blue on this map. And you can see really spread out all across the state on our national forest lands. But why this emphasis on roads? And you can see from this map, we have a ton of roads. We have way too many roads all across the state, especially on our national forest lands. And really every state looks like this. We just have roads. We've been building roads all across public lands everywhere in the US. So if you look at the green shaded areas, that's our national forest lands. And you can see we have a ton of roads in those too and some really high road densities. So a fact that always surprises people, our entire U.S. National Forest System alone has 380,000 miles of roads. And just for context, that's twice as long as our entire U.S. National Highway System. So the Forest Service manages more roads, twice as many roads as we have in our highway system, which is pretty crazy to think about. And of course, roads have a ton of impacts, a lot of harmful impacts on river and forest ecosystems. Uh, all of our speakers will be discussing a bit more about some of these impacts a little bit later on. But you can also see that there are some places on this map where there are no roads that are roadless. And a lot of these places in the green on national forest lands. So these are our wilderness areas. Also a lot of very high alpine environments where it's just not feasible to put a road. But there also are roadless areas. And there's not a ton of these places left, but there were a few remaining places that were still intact, still unroaded. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we created the Roadless Rule to protect these last remaining wild places. But now, the Trump administration is in the process of rescinding or repealing the Roadless Rule and eliminating all of these protections. So obviously there's a ton at stake here. I've already mentioned in Oregon, it's 2 million acres. And these are really, a lot of our remaining old growth forests, ancient forests, our last best remaining public lands, most intact forests. Some of the last best remaining wildlife habitat, places that provide clean drinking water for, again, over 2 million people in places like Portland, like Eugene, like Bend, where I live, Medford, many other communities across the state. And also provide backcountry outdoor recreation opportunities and so many other important values. And, roadless areas, it may sound a little obscure, like where are these places? What are these places? But a lot of these places are places that we all know and love. And I'm sure a lot of you, whether you know you're in a roadless area or not, know a lot of these places and have probably been to some of them. Like in this photo here, the Pacific Crest Trail goes through several different roadless areas in Oregon. And here's just a few photos of some of these threatened places. So the Cascade Lakes roadless area outside of Bend in Central Oregon. This is a picture of Sparks Lake here, which is within that roadless area. Hardesty Mountain is another one outside of Eugene. Lost Lake near Mount Hood in the Mount Hood National Forest. So some pretty, spectacular public lands that are at risk here. Here's a brief timeline of kind of what's been going on with this Roadless Rule rescission over the past year-ish. So this really started last June when the Department of Agriculture, which oversees the Forest Service, announced that the Trump administration will be rolling back the Roadless Rule. And then also in June, and this was good news, the Roadless Area Conservation Act was introduced into Congress. This is legislation that would basically permanently protect these places and kind of nullify the Trump administration's attacks on roadless areas and the Roadless Rule. Congresswoman Salinas from Oregon is the lead sponsor in the House for that bill. And then fast forward to August of last year, the agency published their notice of intent, which really officially began this process of eliminating the Roadless Rule. That also kicked off a 21-day public comment period on the proposal. And then 21 days later, that comment period closed. That was a very short, 21 days is very short for a public comment period, especially when we're talking about tens of millions of acres of public lands. But just within that time, over 600,000 people submitted public comments, and over 99% of those public comments were opposed to this plan to rescind the Roadless Rule, which is a pretty remarkable figure. That's almost unanimous the American public almost unanimously opposes this plan. But despite that opposition, of course, the administration is still going forward with this. So for the past few months and right now, the agency is drafting what's called the draft environmental impact statement, which is basically the draft plan and analysis of the proposal. We expect that to be released potentially any day now, sometime this month. And we also expect another short public comment period to follow that. And then the final decision, final plan, will likely come out either later this year or next year. I do want to just quickly kind of point out the very stark contrast between the 2001 roadless rulemaking, when the roadless rule was created, and what's happening now with the elimination of the roadless rule. So back in 2001, and this process really started kind of in the late 90s, but the Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, held over 600 public meetings all across the nation to inform the public about what they were proposing, to hear and receive feedback from the public. The public comment period on this lasted over 120 days. 1.6 million people submitted public comments. So there was this really huge public process. And you contrast that to what's going on for the last year. So since the Trump administration, published that notice of intent, officially started this process, they've held a total of 0 public meetings across the U.S. And so far, only a 21-day public comment period. So really, this shows that the Trump administration, I don't think they're very interested in public feedback on this or on their other plans for public lands. And that's why we decided to host our own public meetings and events. So like I mentioned before, throughout April, we had 3 different events in Oregon, and there's been dozens of other events like this held all across the country. And we really just wanted to make sure that the public is informed about this plan, which of course impacts our public lands that we own. So we had, again, hundreds of people show up in Bend, Portland, Eugene. We had speakers from Congresswoman Andrea Salinas, again, the lead sponsor of the Roadless Area Conservation Act. We had local elected officials, we had firefighters, we had outdoor athletes, hunters and anglers, outdoor recreationists, people who just love public lands, show up to take action, speak up for the roadless rule and their favorite roadless areas. And tonight we invited 3 of those speakers to join us on this webcast, and I'm going to turn it over to them to speak for a few minutes each. So first up, I'm going to hand it over to Carson States. Carson is a wildland firefighter based in Oregon with experience across federal, state, and private fire organizations. He brings a grounded operational perspective to his work in fire management. Carson is an alumnus of the University of Oregon's Planning, Public Policy, and Management program, and he spends much of his time outside of work in the Cascade foothills. And Carson, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Sammy. Yeah. My name's Carson. I've spent about a decade working in wildland fire across the West. Over that time, I've worked on hand crews and engines with the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry. I was also activated with the Oregon Air National Guard during fire season, and I've worked with private contractors as well. I've seen this work from a few different angles, but always on the ground where these decisions actually play out. The landscapes we're discussing tonight are still holding together in ways that many others no longer are. They haven't experienced the same level of human impact, and that shows up in how often fires start and how they behave once they do. Most of the fires I've been on didn't start deep in wilderness areas. They started where people can get to them, along roads, near access points, at the edges of communities. That pattern repeats itself across landscapes and across seasons. I saw that reinforced when I took a wildfire investigations course. Looking closely at ignition data makes something very clear that fires are overwhelmingly tied to human activity, and those ignition points tend to cluster along roads and places people can reach. It's predictable. As roads expand into new areas, the number of potential ignition points expand with them. Over time, that translates into more starts. More starts mean more initial attacks. More initial attacks mean more exposure for firefighters over the course of the season. And exposure matters. Every assignment carries risk, that's understood. But what changes the equation is volume. Seasons are getting longer, and it's increasingly common to move from one assignment to the next with very little true recovery in between. By late season, fatigue isn't just present, it's cumulative. It affects our judgment, our reaction time, and our decision making in ways that don't always show up until it's too late. There's also a bigger practical issue here. The U.S. Forest Service has an existing $10.8 billion backlog in deferred road maintenance, and that's just to keep the current road system usable. Expanding that system means adding even more infrastructure into a network that agencies are already struggling to maintain. And I've spent enough time on fire assignments to see what that looks like on the ground. Failing drainage systems, brush growing into the road surfaces breaking down to the point where travel slows significantly, especially for heavier vehicles. A road can technically exist on a map while being unreliable for real fire operations. That becomes a firefighter safety issue very quickly. Engines and crew carriers are already operating in steep terrain while under pressure, often late in the shift and sometimes in poor visibility from smoke or weather. When roads are washed out, overgrown, or poorly maintained, there's less room to react when conditions change or something goes wrong. Vehicle accidents remain one of the leading causes of injury and fatalities in wildland fire, and road conditions are absolutely a part of that conversation. Roads also don't behave neutrally on the landscape. They can bring you into an area, but they can also align with wind and carry fire when conditions shift. They can support operations or they can complicate them, and often they do both at the same time. So the question becomes where we place the effort that we have. Resources are not unlimited. Crews, equipment, overhead. There's only so much to go around, and demand continues to increase. That makes it more important to think carefully about where those resources are committed. Roadless areas tend to have fewer ignition sources to begin with. They also tend to have less infrastructure at risk. That changes how fire in those areas can be approached. Under the right conditions, it creates space to use fire more deliberately for natural fuels reduction rather than constantly reacting to new starts. None of this makes fire harmless, and it doesn't mean wildfire should be ignored when it occurs, but it does shape the conditions that we operate in. Decisions about road expansion influence where fires start and how often crews are deployed, and how much cumulative exposure builds over a season. So from where I stand, this is a firefighter safety issue. Expanding roads into intact landscapes increases the number of human-caused ignitions, and with that comes more exposure and more risk carried by the people doing the work. I appreciate your time, and I'm glad to see people engaged in this conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carson. Okay, next I'm going to hand it off to Michelle Emmons. So Michelle is the co-executive director and upper Willamette Riverkeeper for Willamette Riverkeeper. She is based in Oak Ridge, and her work centers on the connection between healthy forests, clean water, and resilient communities with a strong emphasis on protecting intact ecosystems that sustain salmon, drinking water, and the region's natural heritage. Okay, Michelle, go ahead.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here tonight with us. My name is Michelle Emmons, and I serve as the co-executive director and upper Willamette Riverkeeper for the Willamette Riverkeeper organization that stewards the 187 miles of the Willamette River from the confluence all the way up to where it empties out in the Columbia River. But we also support 13 tributaries across the watershed. I also live and work in Oak Ridge, and this is, as you all know, the headwaters of our mighty Willamette River. And that's where what happens in the forest quite literally becomes what flows downstream to communities all across the valley. And so tonight I want to start with a simple framing. The Roadless Rule is not just about protecting land. It's about protecting how an entire watershed functions. Roadless areas are some of the last places where those systems are still working as they should. They store snowpack, they release water slowly, they filter sediment, they shade streams, They create cold, consistent flows that salmon and people depend on. So when we fragment these landscapes with roads, we interrupt all of that. We increase erosion. We send fine sediment down into spawning gravels for salmon. We warm streams, and we change how water moves all across the landscape. Slide 2. So in the Willamette Basin, our water doesn't just start in cities, it starts in forests. And the condition of those forests determines everything that comes next. Now, I want to bring this into real time because we've seen a very clear example of what's at stake. After the 2020 fires in the McKinsey and Middle Fork Willamette corridors, we've been watching recovery unfold across the landscape. And what we're seeing is this: areas that were more intact, areas with fewer roads, more mature forest structure, and less prior disturbance are recovering differently. They're holding soil more effectively, they're delivering less sediment into streams, and they're retaining moisture longer into the season. Critically, they are protecting water quality in ways that directly affect downstream communities and aquatic species. And when we think about starts in those forested headwaters areas, like the Willamette National Forest. And the roadless areas, again, regulate the flow, they filter water, and keep streams cold. Roadless areas are a foundation for salmon, drinking water, and downstream communities. Slide 3. In contrast, areas that have higher road density and prior disturbance, they show a lot more severe erosion, higher sediment loads, and greater impacts to downstream systems. And that sediment doesn't just disappear, it moves into the river system where it can bury spawning habitat, degrade water quality, and increase the cost of treatment for communities downstream. Now, this is a connection that we have to be honest about. Forest condition drives watershed condition. This matters even more as climate change accelerates. We are already seeing lower summer flows, warmer water temperatures, more extreme storm events, and once roads go in, the whole system changes. And while we can mitigate, restore, and adapt, we rarely get back to fully functioning conditions. And from a fiscal standpoint, this is also common sense. Building and maintaining roads in remote forest landscapes is expensive. Cleaning up the downstream impacts is even more expensive. And for salmon, that difference is existential. We are already at the edge of thermal limits for many native fish populations in the Willamette system. Even small increases in temperature or sediment can tip the balance between survival and collapse. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is protecting intact systems up front. This is simply the most cost-effective path forward. And that means that we're protecting the roadless rule. Slide 4. So the good news is that roadless areas represent our best remaining examples of forests that are still functioning at a systems level, because intact forests buffer the extremes. They during heavy rains, they hold water longer during drought, they keep streams cooler during heat waves. And that is, folks, what we call climate resilience, not in theory, but in practice. So when we talk about the roadless rule, we're talking about one of the most effective upstream protections that we have. It prevents new impacts before they happen. It protects natural infrastructure that we really cannot afford to replace. And it maintains the ecological processes that restoration alone cannot rebuild once they are lost. At Willamette Riverkeeper, we do see this full story, all the way from the headwaters to Portland Harbor. And the takeaway is clear. If we want clean water, resilient communities, and a future for salmon in the Willamette Basin, we absolutely have to protect the systems that make those outcomes possible. And that starts in roadless areas. When we protect the headwaters, we are not just preserving landscapes, we are protecting the function of the entire watershed. And everything downstream depends on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, now we have Carl Feindling, who is many things. Carl is a retired fire captain from Bend Fire and Rescue in Bend, Oregon. where he spent 28 of his 37-year fire service career. Today, Carl is a local business owner of Oregon Packworks. He's an avid hunter and angler, and he's the current president of the Friends of Heart Mountain, and also serves on the board for the Oregon chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. He has also served on the Steens Mountain Advisory Council and the board of the Oregon Hunters Association. Go ahead and take it away, Carl.
Well, thanks, Sammy, for the intro. Michelle and Carson, that was awesome. So between, I guess, the three of us, my perspective being outdoors quite a bit and a little bit different alignment than those first two speakers. I was born and raised in Forest, Oregon, on the Idaho border. I've been in Central Oregon, as Sammy said, for 37 years, and I moved here for a lot of the reasons that you folks are outdoors. Love being out. My whole life has been outdoors. It's been an outsized influence on my adult life. As Sammy said, it led me to work in the outdoor products business, starting a business. And as a fireman, believe me, I didn't know a lot about what I was doing, but I just loved being outdoors. I've been a naturalist guide for Wanderlust tours. I've been a hunting guide, and it led me to 2 land conservation jobs. And the passion for being outdoors has led me to Washington, D.C. to lobby, not only for Land Water Conservation Fund, but for the Owyhee Canyon lands. And so roadless areas are really important to my being and what I love to do outdoors. And as a hunter angler, it's helped me kind of has helped shape my appreciation and understanding of the reason for the roadless rule. Numerous roadless areas that I frequent, I typically see no other humans, and game is definitely more plentiful. I think from the motorized portions, we've already heard many stories of the problems that roads can create. I won't belabor that point, but I can tell you as soon as you move away from roads, we start seeing more game, more fish. It's what draws me to those places. The importance in maintaining and fighting for the many important ecological benefits is just a no-brainer. And all of this has led me to many special places in Oregon and all across the country and even in Europe. And Alaska is by far the most special place where the majority of roadless areas exist. If you've never been, put that on your bucket list. In my home state of Oregon, I have many childhood memories and favorite places, such as the Elkhorn Range, Hells Canyon National Recreation Area, of course, the Wallowas, but the Owyhee Canyon lands are very special, of course, not really affected with U.S. Forest Service roadless rule. And I'm going to let Sammy just kind of do what he's doing with photos that I just enjoy. Big vistas, of course, that's why a lot of us go there. Solitude, quiet. Roadless areas that aren't wilderness, but de facto wilderness areas, basically. They typically have high biodiversity, solitude, breathtaking views, and resilience to climate change, as Michelle mentioned. And they provide clean drinking water, as you know, for at least a dozen of our Oregon cities. Outdoor recreation, outdoor products industries are 2 strong economic reasons for maintaining roadless areas as well, along with other traditional uses such as the foraging, hunting, and angling. Recreational endeavors add up to about $1.4 trillion. This just is from 24. We just saw that it exceeded 1.3 in 2025. So those are really important things. And for those of you that may not know how to get involved, I have a little step-by-step that I wanted to leave you some notes on. And in my notes here, I just came across this recently. If you haven't heard of or seen anything about the naturerecord.org, it's a national initiative bringing together knowledge, storytelling, and public participation to elevate the role of nature in the United States. I find that it really melds well with what we're talking about here. The work is rooted in science, guided by communities, and enriched by public participation. And that's what we're talking about with the roadless rule, is how to get together and get a clear and concise comment for posing. And secondly, speak up for the things you love, and especially nature. Nature has no voice in our city or county or state, national government chambers. So democracy lives when we speak up, and it dies when we don't. It's a participant sport. So learn how to give substantive public comments on issues such as our roadless rule, public lands rule, and other overreaching policies eroding public lands, laws, and management. And third, know your phone numbers of emails of elected officials, from Congress to your locally elected officials. They need to hear from you. You're their constituents. They work for us. And lastly, follow science and not rhetoric. Conservation's built on the backs of very many hardy people that use facts to help educate and provide pushback on the nonstop attacks on our remaining intact natural habitats. And thank you again for your attendance and your concern.
All right. Thank you so much to Carthen, Michelle, and Carl for joining us tonight. Also, thank you for your advocacy for these wild roadless public lands. That was all great. Thanks so much. So next, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Chandra, who's going to let you all know how you can take action to defend the Roadless Rule and our roadless areas. And then just after that, reminder, we'll do some Q&A. So if you have questions, make sure to type those into that Q&A box on your screen, and we'll try to answer as many as we have time for. Chandra, go ahead.
Cool. Thanks, Sammy, and thanks for queuing up my portion of this so nicely, Carl. I'm going to talk more about writing comments and other ways of speaking up. First, though, I do want to take a bigger picture step here and just imagine, all of these things that we've just been hearing about and thinking about what the Roadless Rule protects and why it's so important. And then think about if it is repealed and what we would lose. If the Roadless Rule that, covers all of these inventoried roadless areas goes away, then all of those areas would then be subject to the individual forest management plans for the Willamette National Forest, the Mount Hood National Forest, or the Malheur National Forest, wherever they're found. And that could be okay, except that many of those management plans are also currently in a revision process. And with the mandates that are coming down from this administration for maximizing timber harvest and other types of extraction, the news for these roadless areas may not be very good under those management plans. So keeping this rule in place is really vital to ensure that new roads aren't put in. There's, not damage from logging and mining. We don't get increased fire starts in these areas because of increased human access. That our recreation areas remain places we want to visit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here's how we're going to work on maintaining this rule. So go ahead, Sammy. To the next one. So there are, there's a couple different ways we're going to talk about helping to keep this rule in place. This whole thing has to go through a process with at least some public process and environmental analysis. Sammy talked about how the 2001 rule had a ton of public process, and that this one has short comment period and they're trying to push it through really fast. But it was really big news that there was such a short comment period, and it generated 600,000 public comments, most of them wanting to keep these protections in place. So it is important to submit your comment, even if you don't think that they're going to sway the administration's plans. We have to get on the record and show the rest of the public, as well as our elected officials, that this is a big issue that we want them to weigh in on. So let's walk through how to submit comments. I know it can be a little intimidating to go on the record, but we have to remember that we are the public that cares about public lands. So you only have to be an expert about why you care, not in all of the science and research that goes into some of the things that our friends were just talking about. And it's important to make it personal. That's again what you're an expert in. So I'll talk more about how to include that in just a minute. The other important thing is making sure that your comments count. And for that, you can count on Oregon Wild, as well as other organizations working on this. meaning that we want to make sure that they're delivered to the right place and and on time. And so there's usually a deadline. We know what that is. We share that with you and ask you to weigh in before that deadline. And then make sure that if you're just clicking on our action alert that has a comment template, you can trust us that it's going to the right place. We're going to send it to the Forest Service through their through the right means. But there are other ways that you can do that yourself when it's ready. The Federal Register, the official government website for this, is a place that you could go if you're concerned about it going to the right place. But it is important to have it go to the right email or through the right comment process. So even though the comment period hasn't opened yet for the Roadless Rule repeal, this next step, we already have a comment template up and running so that you can submit your comments, and when the time is right, we will get them in a timely fashion to the right place. So this QR code, and there'll be follow-up with this, will take you to that comment template, which you can personalize. And again, I'll go into that in just a second. And you can get that done today, and then ignore all the rest of our emails after this when when the comment period starts. No, don't do that. There's always good information in there. Okay, next slide, Sammy. So writing a compelling comment, again, really just needs to come from your heart and include a couple of key things. So one, you want to say who you are and why you care about these wild places, whether it's because you want your grandkids to experience these places, or you just love spending time in them. Just put that in there. And when you introduce yourself, making it personal around the specific roadless areas that you've been to or that you value, whether it's the source of your drinking water, as Michelle was talking about, or a place that you have explored while hunting, or a place that you go to look at wildflowers. Name the places, and we have a resource that can help you with that. And then pick some talking points that are most appealing to you. And the next slide has some of those talking points. So whether it's, roads making fire danger worse, or, wanting better wildlife corridors, there are talking points that we have that you can help walk you through which ones are most important to you. And then most importantly is you want to tell the Forest Service what you want them to do. And in this case, it's keep the roadless rule in place. You can say that in any number of ways, but and the draft environmental impact statement that's going to come out might have a couple of different alternatives, not just repeal the roadless rule. And we don't know what those are going to look like, but in essence, we're pretty sure that they're all going to be weakening protections for these roadless areas. And so saying that you want to see strong protections remain in place for these wild places against road building and commercial extraction is what you need to say. Okay, on the next slide, we have some of the talking points, and you've been hearing these already tonight, but in your comment, you can include some of these facts, which are on our website and on some of our partners' websites. So, and we've got a toolkit that can help you with all this too, so you don't have to write it all down now. And these are the sorts of things that are in our template that you can personalize. So you can delete things or add things in. But yeah, talk about protecting clean water and how these roadless areas provide drinking water for 60 million Americans, or if you remember from the quiz at the beginning, 2.2 million Oregonians. You can talk about critical habitat for specific species that you're familiar with that depend on these big wild places. You can talk about wildfire starts occurring close to roads and the danger that placing wildland firefighters into these areas, the effect that has on their safety. So here's a bunch of talking points. And again, you can find those on our action page too. Another thing that you can do while we wait for this comment period to begin, I mentioned earlier that, letting this, submitting comments so that we can let our elected officials know that this is important, is a key reason for submitting comments, but you can do that through this other route too. There's a great opportunity outside of this roadless rule repeal to support a piece of legislation that's been introduced in Congress that could make the roadless rule a law. so that it would be harder to repeal in the way that this administration is doing now. It's called the Roadless Area Conservation Act, or RACA, and we have some really strong support for that bill here in Oregon, with most of our representatives co-sponsoring it. I know Sammy talked about this a little bit already. Senator Wyden and Merkley supporting it. So we can thank them, and we can also encourage Representative Hoyle and Bentz to support this bill. Bentz might not ever support it, but you can let them know that it's important to you. So that QR code will take you to a letter that you can send to our elected officials and keep it on the radar. Make sure that they vote for RACA or push it forward. All right, what else can you do? Some more fun things. If after you get done writing to your elected officials, you can join us on a hike. This is one of the best ways of being inspired to write your comment, is to get out there and explore some of these areas. So we can help with that. We are leading a number of guided hikes just in the next month or so, probably within or right around the comment period for the Roadless Rule repeal. So between Sammy, our colleague Phoenix, and our colleague Jonathan, and me, we're leading 5 hikes in roadless areas coming up. So those are all on our website under Discover Oregon, and sign up for a guided hike, I think, is how you get there. But we'll also send out the links to do this. But if you can join us to hike in any of these areas, it will help you get inspired. And if you're not into group hikes, or these aren't in your area, or the timing doesn't work for you, we've also developed a new hiking guide that's on our website. It's a great resource for finding some of these places on your own. There's trail descriptions, directions, and there's a link to an interactive map, so you can kind of zoom in and see where these areas are. And yeah, they're all over this. I've included areas that are all over the state, places that I've been and really enjoy, and hope that the resource for hiking in these areas is useful to you. And one last slide, another thing you can do that's, again, outside of the official comment period, we can do this at any time, is spread the word that this is an important effort, that this roadless rule is important to preserve, that these wild places are worthy of protection. So you can do that by writing and submitting a letter to the editor. That can go to a local paper, an online paper is okay, anything that prints these sort of public opinions. These are usually very short, 200, 250 words. So it honestly could look just like the comment that you submit to the Forest Service. Maybe pare it down a little bit and send it off to the Bend Bulletin or the Eugene Weekly. And that way your community gets to know that this is an important thing to other people around them. And if you're on social media, you can post about roadless areas and the roadless rule during the comment period, or you can like and share what we're posting, what other people are posting. This is a little clip from Nerdy About Nature, who did a whole thing about the roadless rule and why it's important to protect. And he has a lot of followers, so even just amplifying his voice is a way of spreading the word and sharing it with your friends so that they can take action and we can keep these protections in place. So there's some options for you. I hope you'll consider them. Oh, and this is a link to our toolkit on how to write letters to the editor and do social media posts for advocacy. So check it all out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chandra. And again, yes, so many different ways to take action for our public lands and roadless areas, whether you have 30 seconds and you just sign your name to our template comment, or you have a full day and want to join us on one of those guided hikes. We'll also be filling out postcard comments on those hikes that we'll send to the Forest Service once the comment period opens. So many different ways to submit your public comments. So make sure to do that. If you're on this webinar, you're probably signed up for our Oregon Wilds email list, but if not, make sure to do that, and we'll let you know as soon as the draft EIS is released and the public comment period starts, and we'll have an analysis on everything in there. But we do have some time for questions. So if you have questions, you can still submit them into that Q&A box, and I will start reading off some of those. Okay, question. This can go to anyone. Chandra answered part of this in her slides about the Roadless Area Conservation Act, but what members of Congress should we, as in the audience, bug to urge their support for Salinas's Roadless Area Conservation Act? And yes, as Chandra mentioned, in Oregon right now, Congressman Bentz and Congresswoman Val Hoyle are the only two who are not yet officially signed on in support, co-sponsoring that bill. So in Oregon, those are definitely the two. Anyone else want to add on to that? But basically, you can, if you go to congress.gov and you look up Roadless Area Conservation Act, you can see a little tab that says co-sponsors, and you can see every member of Congress who has co-sponsored that. I would highly encourage you to thank those members of Congress, because that's not always an easy thing for them to do, to officially support like a big bill like that would protect so many public lands. And we want them to continue to do those things. So we want to encourage them, thank them, so that they do good things for public lands in the future. And then, of course, urge your members of Congress, other members of Congress who are not yet supporters of that, to co-sponsor it and support that bill. Question is kind of a clarifying question from Doug, addressed to Carl, but I can answer it first because I made the slide. So Doug is just asking if that $1.3 trillion number you mentioned is for roadless areas, and no, and I made the slide so it could have been a little confusing. So the $1.3 trillion, there's a report that was just for, correct me if I'm wrong, Carl, but outdoor recreation annual benefits during that, like 2024, I think it was. On the other side of the slide, there was a very recent report that came out that was specific to economic benefits of protected roadless areas. And can't remember the numbers on those. It was in the
I have it, Sammy. Yeah. Yes. So under Earth economics, I just did a quick Google search when I read Doug's response question. It came up 24 billion is what I see in Roadless Area Conservation Rule. So you could look up eartheconomics.org. They have a fact sheet to go along with that as well. Oh, and maybe I'll also mention a couple other things we haven't talked about. Roadless areas provide 43,826 miles of trails, 11,337 climbing routes, about 21,000 mountain biking trails, and over 1,000 plus whitewater paddling runs. So there's a few more numbers in there that could add into that economic engine.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl. There's a couple of follow-up questions. One person's asking, if we know our representative and senators are already supportive, is there a reason to contact them? And like I said before, yes, definitely to thank them. That's just as important as urging them to support things. Question also, who else do we contact in Congress? And there's a question about if Hoyle and Bentz are not, if they're not your representatives, do they still care? Of course, it's best. They care mostly about their constituents. However, these are all of our public lands, and you may still visit, even if you don't live in Congresswoman Hoyle's district. You may go hike. It's a big district and includes a lot of very special places and public lands. And if you visit those places and you love those places, definitely still reach out to her office or whoever's office it is. I'll also mention you can also reach out to your governors. So in Oregon, Governor Kotek. That is also important because there will needs to be a state response here too. Opposing this, we want Governor Kotek to submit her office's own public comment, and through other avenues opposing the Roadless Rule rescission. We've also heard rumors that potentially one of those alternative options could be like a state-based option, which would severely weaken protections for roadless areas. There's right now 2 states, Colorado and Idaho, who have their own roadless rules. They're not part of the federal roadless rule, and their state roadless rules are much less protective. There's many more loopholes. So if there are state-based options, it's likely that all of those state rules will be a lot less protective, or many states that are not as conservation friendly may just not have rules at all, and there'll be no protections. So make sure to also reach out to your governors, tell them why these places and these protections are really important. Have a question. So this is about so freeways and paved roads definitely inhibit biodiversity connectivity, and make conduits for noise and invasive species and many other impacts. But is there scholarship out there specifically on Forest Service, gravel and dirt roads, how those inhibit wildlife connectivity, and other issues? This person saying that that could be a strong talking point.
I think you could just guide some of the photos that were in the presentation that I had included photos of Forest Service roads, in particular the one in the Tillamook Forest that was literally falling off the edge into the river. And so, yes, something else that's going on is that the Forest Service doesn't have the budget to support road maintenance. In particular, after logging roads are created, a lot of times those roads just kind of go off to the side due to lack of budget for maintenance. And so then there becomes the issue of continued erosion along the edges of those roadsides. Also, if you were to look at a deferred maintenance list of culverts on Forest Service roads, which impact streams greatly, you would see that there is a very long list of culverts in need of replacement in Forest Service road areas. So yes.
Yeah, and that's just like the fish connectivity, right? For the water. I'd have to find it, but I remember seeing a study a couple years back about the impact of open roads on elk and how they do when there's higher road density. Also think about the little critters. I know that, for example, the coastal martin, which is an endangered species, lives on the Oregon coast in the Oregon dunes, which is a roadless area. And I've heard from researchers that even just the roads that do kind of go through that area to get to campgrounds and to the trailheads on the coast end up killing, a couple of those critters that are highly endangered every year. And so because they have to navigate across such things. So obviously some roads are more busy than others, but the more that there's that connectivity, the better most species are going to do.
Yeah, great points. And one I'll add that we may have discussed earlier, but roads are also one of the primary ways that invasive weeds are transported along vehicles, and they love, those disturbed areas along the sides of roads. A lot of these invasive weeds are often very, very flammable, and often one of the reasons why a lot of fires start. Does anyone else want to add on to that? We have about a minute, so this was probably the last question. Okay. Well, thank you all so much to our speakers, Carl, Carson, Michelle, Chandra. Thanks for joining us tonight, giving your perspective, speaking up for roadless areas. To everyone out there, thanks for joining us tonight. Again, there will be a recording of this available within the next day or two if you want to go back um, and see any of the slides or any of the talking points that you can use in your own public comments. And then lastly, yeah, just stay tuned. Look out for our emails from Oregon Wild for when that public comment period opens. And also, we hope to see you on a hike if that's of interest to anyone. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much one more time, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks for sponsoring, Sammy.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.